Welcome back to Cardistrytalk. My name is Caleb Smith, and this is episode 49. Today I am joined by the incredible Matthew Beaudouin. You may know him for his work with Cardistry Touch, for innovating Erdnase Go Round and really looking at all the variations that entails, as well as his endeavors into card theory and streaming. He's a really awesome member of the community, and I'm super happy to have him here. Matthew, welcome to the show.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so just quickly want to note that like streaming was streaming with Matt or streaming with whoever you were streaming with was kind of an
Sure.
inspiration when I was first getting into this. So definitely super
I'm
cool to
glad.
be to connect the two together almost
Yeah.
for the today.
I'm glad other people are doing it. I think it's decreased the number of messages that I get saying like, "Hey, when are you going to interview with this or that?" It's like, well,
Yeah,
well, I don't know. If you look at the latest posts, you might get a sense of how that's
it's
going.
been
So I'm very happy that yourself and Birger and whatnot have been taking on this notion of talking to the artists and trying to get to know them. So I
yeah.
appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been super fun, and I think especially for people early on like me when I was getting into this, it's really nice to kind of just like soak in as much of the culture as possible. So I always start out with asking people on my story what they would like to hear about. One thing that kind of popped up early on was tutorials and stuff like that. There's people asking whether you're going to do another tutorial soon, which, but I'm more so interested in how you go about making a tutorial, because you've made a lot of tutorials in your time, from spooky to tips on Erdnase Go Around, stuff like that. So do you have any tips on how to
Yeah.
make good tutorials?
Yeah, that's a good, interesting thing that I don't think about much these days. But I think so. I mean, I've done sort of two categories of tutorials. I've done my own tutorials on my own, and I've done them with Cardistry Touch, and those are completely different experiences.
Mhm.
Because when working with Dimitri Ladislas, it's and Francois, um, it's really nice because you could just sort of show up with your cardistry and then say, "Hey, do the move." You do the move, and then they got like the really good, the good shot
Mhm.
from the good angle. And Yeah, so in that sense, like that makes it very easy. I think when we do that, we sort of focus on trying to get good shots at different angles and different speeds and whatnot, and then also try to talk about the high level stuff. How do you approach the move?
Mhm.
I don't know how much people actually pay much attention to that in the thing, and I think that's always one of the greatest paradox of tutorials is that I certainly see a lot of people asking for tutorials, but when you look at the moves that people do, then they don't really necessarily show up. Like I don't think I've seen like one person do whiplash, one or
Mhm.
two people do whiplash, right? And Yeah, so I think it's interesting. Notably, that's probably because most people who do cardistry don't actually post everything that they do. So, there might be a large population of people who are interested in learning moves, but don't post them,
Mhm.
because that's not really the culture that we have. So, um, but yeah, I mean, when I've done them on my own, it's been way more of a pain and way more of an endeavor. And I think it's been a while since I've done that because it's so much easier to work with professionals.
Yeah.
um, but yeah, I mean, it's sort of the same thing. You want to. I mean, one thing that I always found interesting is trying to understand like what is difficult about the move, right? Because for something like Whiplash, I came up with that in what 2014 or 15, and the tutorial was made in what 2018 or so, maybe.
Mhm.
There's like a lot of time that I've been doing the move, and it's one of the moves that I just keep doing because it's fun to do. Um, and so, what is it for, what is difficult about that move is like completely gone to me because I've done it so many times that I don't, remotely thinking about doing it, right? Um, and so, trying to identify those things is kind of the most important thing when you're doing a tutorial. It's kind of like, if you're trying to teach a concept, like, if you're trying to teach math, the first level of teaching is sort of explaining it to yourself, and that's sort of what most people end up doing, right? And sort of what I've caught,
Mhm.
like, if you look at my cardistry theory stuff is sort of what I've been doing, which is not ideal. But like explaining it to yourself is kind of like the first step of explaining something, right? Because
Mhm.
it's an explanation. It's the easiest explanation that you can get to, but it's not necessarily an explanation that is conscious of the audience.
Yeah.
And so that's basically the thing, right? So if you can find all the things that are difficult and not obvious about the move and point them out in the tutorial, then that's going to be better than just a demo, right? Because
Yeah.
the demo is sort of leaves that to the audience.
And
And also, I mean, I think it's also fun to talk about the high level things about the move, right? So I don't know if that's just indulgence, but I always think the best example of that is for the tutorial for Squeeze from a million years ago. They explain all the mechanics of the move, but at some point they say, yeah, like, yeah, oh yeah, when you do Squeeze, you should start, with your hands sort of vertical, and then as you do the move, you go horizontal, right? Which is sort of thing you wouldn't guess by yourself at all. And that's a great little tip that really does have an impact on how you do the move, and also is the sort of thing that you can then add creativity to by thinking about, oh, how do I change that? How do I change that presentation? And so maybe that's another value of tutorials, is that even if you don't do the move, you learn not just mechanics but ways to approach a move, right? The I just learned Kaching by Dimitri. He
mhm.
put it up on a week ago or so. And that's another thing where it could tell you something about how you can present a move. Like, it doesn't always have to be super flowy and whatnot. It can be very robotic, and so that's also the sort of insight you can get from learning a move.
Mhm. And one thing that you mentioned that's like, I don't know if it's paradoxical, but sometimes the people that like have made the moves aren't the best at teaching the move because they've a lot of times you forget kind of the little nuances that were troublesome. Whereas like some person that just learned the
Hmm.
move may be able to teach it better because they know those little hiccups along the way. If
Yeah.
that makes any sense. I think something ECAT has talked about. Like she's not the best cardist, but she feels like she's good at making tutorials because she's not the best cardist.
Yeah. Um, Yeah, I mean, I think there's not only is it that you lose the nuances, but also when you're creating a move, it's very different from learning a move, because when you're creating something, you're sort of pulling something out of all the moves that you've done before, right? It's a very personal thing,
Hmm.
and so all the moves that I've done feel like relatively natural to me, and are relatively easy to come up with because they're sort of like they're pulled from the same space as all the other things, right? And
Hmm.
so that means that things that are obvious to me are not going to be obvious to anyone else, even if I remember the process of learning. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, someone else learning the move might be able to better point out, like, here's the weird stuff about this that
Yeah,
Matt would never figure out.
that math you already figured out. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then one thing I do want to talk about, since we're talking about kind of, um, you know, how when making moves we're drawing from stuff we've already created. One thing I always like to talk about is the creative process when making moves. I think that's a topic that is always a highlight on the show. It's always a focus. So I'm sure it probably varies for you a lot, but do you have any kind of creative method when trying to make a move?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's changed a lot over the years. I think my motivation has changed, and therefore my process has changed, right? Because the process is really just in service of reaching a certain goal. And so, I nowadays I think artistry is sort of taking a back seat to my life. I'm focusing on other things. And it's still there, and it's always going to be there, but
Hmm.
I don't think I'm really spending as many weekends, like really trying to knock out moves like I used to. And so, what I actually do with cardistry nowadays is mostly use it as a way to fiddle with cards and help me think through other things, right, by fidgeting. And so I'm sort of looking for moves that accomplish that, right? And so now I'm mostly interested in things that feel good to do, that feel fun, and not so much things that'll look super cool in
Hmm.
CardistryCon. Um, which really just lowers the bar. And for better or for worse, I think it allows me to do things that I might not do otherwise because I would feel like, oh, this is too boring, and that can get me to things that are interesting, nonetheless. But yeah, and so it's sort of about how do you find something that's interesting and then develop it into a bigger thing, right? So I think the short answer to this question is, well, I have a book about it, and so I could redirect people to the book. And you can get it for as low as 1 cent. So hopefully it shouldn't be too much of a monetary barrier. But um, yeah, I mean, I, I think I think one way in which my perspective has changed is to think about how you know where does the move what is the goal of the move, right? I think is kind of an interesting thing. So now that I'm interested in things like music and other creative tasks, and I'm studying creative process more broadly as a full-time job. Um, which I guess just to clarify, like I'm not doing a PhD in trying to make software tools that help people do creative things, right? So um, I think uh, as a result, I've thought a lot more about creativity in the context of not doing cardistry. And what's just interesting about that is that you have when you're doing a creative thing, there are multiple levels of abstractions to what you're doing, right? And that's super obvious in something like music, right? At the end of the day, music is represented as a bunch of waves that compress and expand in a very particular way that your ear picks
Hmm.
up on, and then so you can sort of abstract that up into things like notes, and those or rhythms, that looking at time and pitch as two things, and then you can look at notes together, sort of forming chords, and those chords forming progressions and being part of a scale, and all of those things. And those are all abstractions that are properly named, right? Because we've developed a theory around how we do music. And, you know, uh, I think in cardistry, we don't have any of that named in any way. And I don't think you necessarily super can, nor is it particularly helpful. But I think it's still there. I think part of what happens, part of the reason we have names for all these things is because we experience things as notes and chords and things like that. Even though they're not real, they're abstracted things relative to the compression and expansion of the waves. And so, the question that I ask myself is when I'm creating a move, like what is the thing that is being communicated here? What is the abstraction about this move? Um, and so, you know, that that could be taken either very literally, and I think that's it doesn't have to be. So, there's some people who think about, how can you make cardistry like a proper quote unquote art form by making
Hmm.
it communicate something, about the human condition or things like that. And, very rarely can you actually do that. And there are a few examples. There's that one person whose name I forget who did that anxious looking move, and that looks great. Even
Hmm.
Brian Tudor way back when had things like that. Um, and I think that's interesting, but it's not really what cardistry is good at necessarily. And I think it's worth doing, but it's not what most people are interested in. Um, and so the but at the end of the day, you're still sort of seeing an abstracted version. Like what like one way to think about it is like, what do you remember from a move, right? Do you remember every individual mechanic? Like maybe, but you usually remember a general shape or a general set of motions and things like that. And those are the things that are worth optimizing for. Um, so yeah, and I think when you have that sort of framing, then you think about how can I remove as much noise from a move as possible, right? Like and I think yeah, if I'm creating a move, then I want to communicate something like something that's interesting about the move. Like the move exists for a reason. It's not just a collection of mechanics that I managed to throw together. Um, and to communicate that, it has to be doing so very clearly. And so the question is, how do you remove any sort of packets that aren't doing anything? Things like that. And I don't know. I think, if I'm as I've grown into an old cardistry man, I have looking at what the cardistry kids are up to these days. I would certainly say this is something that people could improve at, is not focus necessarily as much on the individual mechanics that are super important. It's always too bad because as a creator, it's super important. Like all these little details that you put a lot of effort into making work, if no one sees them, they don't matter, right? They matter to you, and that's important. But as creating a move that has an impact in cardistry, it doesn't matter. Um, so yeah, I think in a shorter, maybe better phrase version of all of this, I would say that I think my cardistry creative process has turned into, in one way, just doing things that feel good, right? Not trying to have an impact and just having fun with cards. And that's a very simple thing. I know it feels good, and so I could just make things that feel good. But if I'm trying to make a meaningful move, then it's trying to understand like how is the move perceived? How is it abstracted up into a high level? And how can I reduce any sort of noise around that? Like any extra packets and things. So I mean, that's why I like to stick with 4 packets. I think partially because it's all I can do, but also because I feel like every time I try to add a packet, it just sort of adds noise and doesn't really do anything interesting. Not that that can't be done. Other people do a very good job with it. I just can't do it, it seems.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's interesting too. A lot of like you said, comfy moves. I think that's something Elliot Slovin, when I had him on earlier, said he focuses on too. It's kind of the stuff that's comfy and that you enjoy performing for yourself. It feels like over a while, more and more people are starting that have been in the community for a long time are starting to lean more towards those, which I think is just interesting. I don't know if it's just because of the influence of so many new people, or obviously as you get older, there's jobs and stuff too. But it does seem like as artists get older, they tend to more lean towards the comfy stuff.
Yeah, no, that is sort of what I mean by becoming an old cardistry person. Is that the desire to sort of impress and dazzle sort of fades, and you just go back to wanting to just have fun with cards. And so and it's something that as you pointed out is definitely a pattern, right? Way back in what 2015, I think whenever I think Nikolai sort of coined the term comfy cardistry, right? Like he was an old cardistry man at the time.
Hmm.
And I think he's come around to making things that really hit hard. And not that those are necessarily incongruent, but
Yeah.
yeah, different. Like you can't make a comfy mood that goes hard. But yeah, I think it really is a pattern that as you sort of like lose the fire to impress you, you go back to stuff you want to do.
And then another thing with the creative process, with not just necessarily creating your own moves, is kind of exploring moves or concepts that have already been created. And I think something you've done, obviously, has been Erdnase Go Around, is fully kind of exploring that move to its not necessarily full its potential, because I'm sure there's more to find, but really expanding kind of what has been done with that move. So, do you have any kind of thoughts on how to expand on an already established idea or premise?
Yeah. I mean, I think I always think that's one of the things that I find the most fun, and is a big part of, I guess, my process in general, is really exploring, what 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 a move is about and what it allows you to do, right? In design, you might call it the affordances, right? What are the things that the move makes you want to do, right?
Hmm.
And so with Erdnase Go Around, I think it's kind of obvious in that you get, a lot of juggling type moves, right? You sort of get the fountain, you get, I think the most complicated one I did was the juggling move called Factory, right? Where you sort of like cross arms and have things go into box shape. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, in that case, I think it was drawing pretty explicitly from from another domain, right, and just trying to apply it, which I think some people like to do a lot of. I think Andrew Villa tries to do things like this, right? He draws from architecture and whatnot.
Hmm.
Um, I think in like what I ended up doing more of and exploring these spaces, because actually I have a lot of examples of this. If you go way back in my YouTube history, which I don't recommend doing, you could see this video I had called, actually two times, Flipping Tiles and Sigma, were two videos in which I basically, for Flipping Tiles, I had this basic idea of like, sort of I guess it must have been, was it Windows 10? I don't know. Yeah, it must have been Windows 10. But this idea that you have these like tiles in sort of a thing that flip around, right? And it's sort of one and
Hmm.
then and move, right? And so I explored that concept at a relatively high level and tried to come up with a bunch of moves that did that. Um, and put them all in a video and call it flipping tiles. Great. And then with Sigma, I come up with like a, just a grip, which is kind of like a weird version of a Z grip, of a sideways C grip. And I just tried to find all the things that came out of that. And one thing that I found in doing that is that you can come up with a lot of pretty different moves from that. Um, but usually there's one that stands out and one that's better than the rest. And so I think one, and this is kind of a big part of exploded process is to think about like if you come up with as like a high volume of ideas and of moves, then you can actually select the best one, right? Um, and so I think in terms of like Sigma, there's not one version of that move that I do, maybe two. Flipping tiles is only one that really exists. The other ones are not really really worthwhile, especially given that the other version exists, right?
Hmm.
It's kind of like, I don't know, when I listen to music, sometimes I listen to an artist and I have one track that's really good. And I'm like, oh man, this is really cool. I like this a lot. I wonder what else they've made. And then the rest sounds kind of the same, like kind of exactly the same.
Hmm.
And so then like to me, for how I like to listen to music, which, is something, uh, like all of those songs like don't really need to exist because there's kind of the best version of it that exists like that.
Hmm.
And I think it's the same for Cardistry, right? Given a bunch of different flipping tiles moves, only one needs to exist really. And I think that sort of speaks to the concept of the abstraction that I'm talking about, right? In a sense, if you think about all the possible Cardistry moves that you could possibly do, you know,
Hmm.
uh, you could think about like a subspace of that, which is all the flipping tiles moves, right? And they all sort of share some like you know kind of indescribable quality about them. You could describe the flipping tiles aspect of it, but there's more to it. There's some mechanics that go with it and stuff like that. The flatness of it. All these descriptors that sort of define another space of things, and then every single one move is sort of plucking a single point from that space, right? And then when you evaluate all of them as an artist, you could decide which one you like the most, and if your taste aligns with that of the communities, then you'll have something that people will like as well, right? And so, in a sense, what I'm saying is you can define this high level space, which is part of all possible Cardistry moves. And in the case of flipping tiles, it's part of the larger category um, of two-handed cuts. And you could sort of like define this space and understand what this space really is about and really understand what you can do with it, and then find the best version of that. And so I think not only can you do a bunch of variations of that, but also is a great way to find the best version of a move, and therefore render a bunch of possible moves like kind of useless, which is maybe a good thing. Yeah, obsolete. Yeah, exactly. So I guess your original question was like, how do you go about doing that? Which is, I guess, the trickier thing than just waxing poetic about categories of cuts. But yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, it's about understanding um, what makes the mechanic interesting, what makes it unique, what makes it different from other moves. And I think in a creative process in general, here I'm going at all abstract again, but in the process of creating a move, in my experience, there's kind of like a pivot points, right? Where for a while you're sort of like fiddling with things and trying to understand like what you could possibly do, and there's a tipping point where like, oh, this is what the move's about, right? This is the way that I could frame this move. This is kind of like the same thing as saying like this is part of the space that it occupies in all of cardistry. And then it's just about like making it the best version of that, right? Which is kind of the same thing as coming up with a bunch of variations in that small space and finding the best one. So yeah, so it's about figuring out what makes that unique, what makes that space unique. You know, what is the album of moves about flipping tiles, right?
Mhm.
That live in that universe, and you know, try to make a bunch of different versions to understand. And I think an important bit is come up with a bunch of variations that are not good as well is important, because in you know the all bad ideas still have value in some ways, right?
Mhm.
This is an important tenet of brainstorming in general creative thinking, is that you know you can come up with a bunch of ideas, even if they're bad, they're still valuable because there's something interesting about the idea. You can find something interesting, or it can make you think about something else that's interesting. And so, you know, it can be so easy to get stuck to think about, and it's something I do all the time myself, is get stuck in thinking about like what is the if the next mechanic I'm doing is not like the best, you know, move of the year kind of material, then it's not worth doing. And that's just a bad way to create things because it's super slow and doesn't
Mhm.
guarantee an answer because you're sort of restricting yourself to this very small space of possible things because you're not willing to take, you know, the risk, which is what it is of, you know, having a bad idea. Um, yeah,
Mhm. Yeah.
hopefully that
Um,
makes sense.
yeah, I think there's definitely something to be drawn from that. I think what I found interesting from just talking with so many people in the community is that a lot of people that have that people really respect in the community, like Leo Flores is one that I know specifically said this. Like he says he makes bad moves constantly, but he doesn't necessarily show those ones off. But they always lead to something more substantial. Um,
Absolutely, yeah.
so I think that's interesting, especially when I first started. You know, you see people performing that you see the cream of the crop, and you just think, oh, that's what they just do, and it's not
Yeah, yeah,
necessarily the case.
yeah. Obviously, Tobias wakes up and you know does a uncut video like every morning. Like that's part of his morning routine. He does that and then he brushes his teeth. That's how it goes. So, yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's not only is it a normal thing to not be perfect, which is always worth emphasizing, but it's actually a useful thing. It is pragmatic. It is optimal to come up with bad ideas. And so I think if you know anyone can take anything from this is like you know bad ideas are useful and
Hmm.
important and also a lot of fun.
Cool.
I mean, there's a lot of moves in cardistry that you would not call good, but they're really funny. I think like Kevin Ho sort of excels at this category of moves. This is
That's exactly what I was
things
kind of
that I
thinking.
yeah exactly yeah like I wouldn't necessarily call a move of the year, but in a sense they're very good because they're very funny. Um, but you know and they're still valuable because they make you think about you know what cardistry is and what cardistry can do. So you know that's it's important.
Yeah, and almost with like anything, you kind of have to know within kind of like the rules of card. If you consider there's like rules of cardistry, you kind of have to know like
Hmm.
what is good and what is bad to know what to kind of. I mean, it kind of depends on what your goals are, but you have to know like if a move is good or if it's bad to show it off, and to do that, you need to make bad stuff so you know what's bad, in a sense.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So.
Um, yeah, and I mean, you know, making bad material is unavoidable, and so you have a choice of embracing it or not. And when you embrace it, indeed, then it refines your taste, right? So this is actually something I think about when you know you're teaching kids how to do math, right? You know, if uh, if you can get, you know, it's important for kids to be able to fail, right? And try to do a problem and then
Mhm.
not like necessarily get to it immediately. Because if you know, the standard strategy for teaching math nowadays is basically like you tell people how to solve a problem and then you give them a variation of the problem and they solve the same thing. And they don't really learn high level things, or at least that doesn't really motivate that. Because if you don't like try to do something and fail at it, you don't know what it means to succeed as well, right? You're not doing anything if you're not making decisions that are good or bad, and seeing when they work out and when they don't. So yeah, that's a great point.
Mhm. And then one other topic that I would like to go over is you said you didn't directly have like a super big impact on it, but you kind of reviewed it as kind of the annotation system that Cardistry Touch kind of put out. And I know you've talked about kind of like music, how there's music notes and things can be kind of abstractions. Do you think we'll ever get to the point with Cardistry where it's like that, to where we can have like, I mean, obviously we've already created the notation system, but like where people will understand it and we'll be able to use these abstractions in a way that we don't really understand quite yet?
Yeah. The notation is an interesting project, because I think it's and it's a very difficult thing, right? Because what makes cardistry interesting is that it's the constraints that come with it, right? The fact that you have so many fingers doing so many things at once is kind of what makes it super interesting. Um, and As a result, that sort of means that whatever notation you come up with is also going to be extremely complicated. And if you look at something like, if you look at music, in a sense, it's also really complicated because if you're,
Oh
trying
yeah.
to make, a score for a cellist, right? There's like not only the notes, but also sort of all the extra stuff that you put on top of that. All the uh, I'm forgetting all of the possible words, but you know what I mean. Like, what makes a cello sound like a cello instead of just a playback, like a MIDI playback of a virtual instrument. Um, but in practice, what it looks like is that the performer is bringing a lot to the table, right? They're bringing a lot of interpretation to the table, and a lot of stuff that can't and shouldn't be encoded in the score. And so as a result, the level of complexity you can get away with music is mostly that you're defining pitch and time. And that's like two things, right? Whereas if
Hmm.
you're talking about describing a move, then you're talking about positions and times, you're talking about like rotations and things like that, all of which are very difficult to describe concisely, right? And if you look at animation software, like that's basically the same problem. And you don't like the way you make the problem tractable is by only looking at it one thing at a time. Um, and that's kind of what the notation that Curtis Dutch came up with was supposed to do. Is it focuses on what are the manipulations you're doing, and then out of that sort of comes the actual position every time, right? Um, but the success of the notation, I think what it means for it to be successful is first of all an interesting question. What is it? In a sense, like it would be cool to be able to see see the cardistry notation for a move and just be able to do it directly.
Hmm.
Um, but I think it's become pretty clear that that seems very unlikely. Not just in terms of like making the move work, and actually you can do it. It's it's a bit of a hassle, but most importantly, it doesn't beat just looking at the move and be like, ah, I get it, right? So I think the cardistry notation on its own is not really set up for success because of what's hard about cardistry and interesting about cardistry. So in another sense, the annotation itself could be useful just as a different way to represent cardistry, right? So, it is very intangible to think of a move as just like a video or an experience, right? And so, some of the things that Cardistry touched on in their big old video was, the extent to which, if you can encode cardistry in basically like a computer can understand it, then now you can start to think about like archiving moves in a very meaningful way, looking at differences between moves in a meaningful way, looking at you can start to classify moves in a meaningful way, right? Like using actual classifiers and things like that. And you can do all these like super interesting things, which I think would be lovely to do, but it's not really anyone's priority, so I'm not holding my breath. Um, and I think that would all be very interesting academically. Um, Now, I think the most potential there is for notation is as something that supports a tutorial, right? And so in that case, you're not so much talking about a notation that needs to encode everything. It just needs to support something that's happening on screen, right? And so, the most basic version you can possibly think about this is in my tutorial for a spook. I had all these like different arrows, sort of going about, right? You have all these visual augmentation on top of the things. And so you could imagine something like this for Cardistry where, maybe the notation represents something that is missing from the video just because of the angles, or it can highlight certain things about the mechanics, right? And so then it's kind of like, subtitles that are sort of augmenting the video. And so I think that is probably the most useful Cardistry is going to be in terms of like just literally consuming the annotations as a human being, which sort of branches off from the first thing. And so I think part of what makes the existing notation difficult is that it's sort of trying to do both things. Maybe not so much the second. Maybe I don't stand by that. I think that was sort of like part of the pitch, but maybe not so much in practice. But yeah, it's sort of supposed to be something that is both usable for humans and usable for computers. But we're looking for different things, and for something as visual as Cardistry, then it's difficult to try to remove all the visual aspects of it and just encode the information there. So yeah, I think there's a ton of interesting work. I would love for people to do it, but yeah, few people are as interested in this academic stuff as maybe I would like.
Well, yeah, I would say probably most of the community probably isn't super into it, in my opinion. I don't.
That's been my experience as well. I mean, it's interesting because I think people are interested as spectators, but not necessarily as participants.
Oh yeah, there's way
Like
more spectators than participants for sure.
yeah, as at Cardistrycon, after the long video, I think certainly a bunch of people probably weren't very interested, and that's okay. But there were a ton of people who were really interested in the notion, interested to see where it goes, but not necessarily interested in taking it on, which is completely fine. It's a very reasonable thing. But I think that's the primary obstacle for anything to happen in terms of notation. It's just that it's a hard problem, and people can't really see a tangible benefits immediately. So yeah,
it becomes very hard to learn something too if it's not already established, or to have the motivation to learn it. I think it'd be it's a really interesting concept. There's just so many variables and kind of hurdles to get around. I think they referenced like that there is notation for like dancing and stuff like that, or that might have been mentioned before. So like there is ways to go about notating physical motion, I guess.
But juggling has a very, very clever notation.
It does,
right? Which basically I forget how it works, but it sort of encodes like what hands are doing at times, and how many balls are up in the air and how long it takes them for them to come back. But in the case of juggling, what's possible to do with juggling is much more constrained.
Yeah.
And so therefore you can sort of leverage some quote unquote symmetries to make the notation easier. And so, that's kind of cheating. And with dancing, you're not talking about interacting with actual items, which makes things much more complicated. Usually you're talking about showing, a few articulations, like general hands, and like, your limbs. But if you consider your fingers as 10 different mini limbs, then that's already much more complex than what you're talking about in a dancing notation. So I think it is there's definitely a lot of inspiration, a lot of people that have done a lot of work in those spaces. But Cardistry is even more complex than those.
Yeah, I guess I definitely didn't take that into account for sure. But yeah, it is interesting, and it would be like really cool one day if there's like almost like sheet music for Sybil or something ridiculous like that. I think that'd be really fun. But until it's practical, I don't see that really if it's ever becomes practical. I don't think we'll see that ever happen.
Yeah.
So at the end of the show, what I like to do is roll out the close-up pad. That's just my way of saying, is there any last nugget you would like to leave the audience with, or anything you'd like to promote before we close things up?
Let's see. No, I think if you're interested in creative process in cardistry, I have written a book about it, and it's actually aged not the worst. It's maybe it can be a little bit dense for some people, I've heard, but overall, I think it's worth paging through it, and it's pay what you want model, so it should be affordable. But it's I hope more people can think deeply about how they do cardistry, because really at the end of the day, doing that is literally defines my career. It has changed me forever. And so I hope that can work for other people. So have fun shuffling cards.
Yeah, that's always super important for sure. Have fun. As always, I'll have links to Matt's stuff in the description, as well as that book for you guys to check out if you want to. Matt, thank you for taking your time to be on the show and for dealing with the little hiccups we've had. I definitely appreciate you taking your time. I hope everybody enjoyed and learned something, and we'll see you guys in the next one.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much for having me, and thanks for doing the podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here.